I rented a small apartment in Plateau-Mont Royal for a week while visiting Montreal. The area was lively, full of narrow streets lined with old brick buildings, small cafes, and little shops that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. I had booked the apartment because the price was unbeatable and the host had excellent reviews. When I first arrived, I was immediately drawn to how quiet the building was despite being in the middle of the neighborhood. The hallways smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning products, the kind that never fully cover the smell of age. The apartment itself was modest but clean, with hardwood floors, white walls, and tall windows that let in a lot of light during the day. It had a small kitchen, a living area with a couch, and a bedroom with a walk-in closet. Everything seemed fine, almost perfect for a short stay in the city. On my first night, after unpacking and organizing my things, I noticed the tall, old mirror in the walk-in closet of the bedroom. I hadn't seen it in the listing photos. Its frame was dark wood, chipped and tarnished, with patterns carved into it that were hard to make out in the dim light. The glass itself wasn't perfectly clear. It had small spots and faint scratches across the surface. It leaned against the wall at an angle, as if it had been moved there from somewhere else long ago. I didn't think much of it at first. I set my suitcase down, placed my clothes in the closet, and tried to ignore it. The first couple of nights, I didn't feel anything unusual. I went out in the city, returned tired, cooked a simple meal, and went to bed. But even on that first night, there was a nagging feeling every time I walked past the closet. Sometimes, I thought I saw a shadow in the mirror, like the shape of a person standing behind me. I told myself it was my imagination, or the reflection of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. The apartment was on the second floor, so the light outside was soft, and I was alone, tired from walking through the city all day. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just fatigue. By the third night, the feeling of being watched became harder to dismiss. I was brushing my teeth in the small bathroom adjacent to the bedroom when I caught a flash in the mirror. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw someone standing directly behind me. I spun around immediately. The bedroom was empty. The closet doors were closed, my suitcase was in its place, and nothing had moved. My heart raced, and I had to sit on the edge of the bed for a few minutes to calm down. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe my reflection had looked different because I had leaned in at the wrong angle. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next couple of days, subtle things began happening. The mirror seemed to show angles that didn't exist. One evening, I was folding clothes in the bedroom, and in the mirror, the closet door appeared slightly open, even though I had closed it and double-checked. I went over and pushed the door closed again, convinced it had just shifted slightly on its hinges. Another time, I looked into the mirror from the kitchen doorway, and it reflected a corner of the room that didn't line up with the actual layout. My rational mind kept coming up with explanations: poor lighting, warped glass, or my own tired eyes. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I started keeping my belongings in other parts of the apartment, moving my suitcase into the living room and using the bedroom only for sleeping. Even then, I couldn't stop checking the mirror whenever I walked past it. I became hyper-aware of every creak in the floorboards, every draft from the windows, every shadow cast by the streetlights outside. Nights were the worst. The apartment was silent, except for the occasional distant siren or muffled voices from the street. But in the bedroom, it felt heavy, almost like the air had weight. On the last night, I went to bed around midnight, exhausted from a long day of walking through Montreal. I had left the closet door slightly ajar, hoping it would feel less oppressive. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a soft but unmistakable sound. Something was dragging across the floor inside the closet. At first, I froze, unsure if I had actually heard it. The sound continued, slow, deliberate, scraping against the hardwood. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might wake the neighbors. I stayed on the bed, listening, telling myself it was probably a loose hinge or an old floorboard. But the sound was different. It had a weight to it, like something solid being moved. I finally forced myself to get out of bed. The apartment was dark except for the faint light from the street filtering through the curtains. I crept toward the bedroom door, trying to make as little noise as possible. The sound stopped abruptly as I approached the closet. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, staring at the slightly open doors. My hands were shaking, my stomach knotted. I took a deep breath and flung the doors open. The closet was empty. My clothes were where I had left them, my suitcase untouched. There was nothing in the room except the mirror, leaning against the wall. I realized then that I wasn't just unnerved by the mirror itself. but by the way it distorted reality. It didn't reflect things as they were. It reflected what could be, or what my mind imagined in the dark. I felt a wave of relief mixed with lingering fear. There was nothing supernatural here, nothing that couldn't be explained. It was just an old mirror, poorly placed in a quiet, isolated apartment in a city where no one knew I was staying. My imagination had been feeding off the silence, the dark, and my own exhaustion. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat in the living room with the lights on until dawn, watching the quiet street below, trying to calm my mind. By morning, I had decided I wouldn't wait until the end of the week to leave. I packed quickly, triple-checking that I had everything. I left the apartment in the same condition I had found it, locked the door behind me, and walked down the stairs with a sense of relief that I hadn't felt all week. Walking away from the building, I felt the tension leave my shoulders. The city outside was already alive with people heading to work, cafe owners opening doors, and the faint smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakeries. I realized that my fear had been real, but it was contained within my own mind. The mirror, the creaks, the shadows, they were all part of the apartment's character, nothing more. The relief of stepping onto the street, into the sunlight, among people, made the apartment feel even smaller and darker in my memory. Even now, months later, I remember the apartment clearly. The mirror still stands out in my mind, the way it warped reflections and created a sense of unease. I sometimes wonder if anyone else staying there would feel the same way, or if it was just me, tired and alone, letting small details grow into something larger. Either way, I know I won't stay in a place like that again, no matter how good the reviews or how cheap the price. The feeling of being watched, even when there was no one there, is something I don't want to experience again. Leaving that apartment, I learned something simple but important. Sometimes the most unsettling experiences aren't about anything supernatural or unexplainable. They are about being alone in a space that doesn't quite fit, where small imperfections become magnified and your mind fills in the blanks. I left Montreal with a new appreciation for light, open spaces, and familiar surroundings. I never went back to that apartment, and I never will, but I remember it vividly. Every creak, every shadow, every distorted reflection. It's a memory that lingers not because of ghosts, but because of how real and human fear can feel when it comes from within yourself. I rented a small desert bungalow in Joshua Tree for a solo weekend getaway, hoping for some quiet time away from the city and a chance to photograph the stars without light pollution. The listing had dozens of glowing reviews, and the host had promised ultimate stargazing privacy. I drove out on a Friday afternoon, leaving the noise of Los Angeles behind, and the highway gradually narrowed into a long stretch of empty desert road, lined with sand, jagged rocks, and sparse clusters of cacti. By the time I turned onto the dirt track that led to the bungalow, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the desert in oranges and deep purples. There was no cell signal, no one around for miles, just the empty, wide-open landscape stretching to the horizon. The bungalow appeared almost suddenly, tucked into a small clearing, its modest structure blending in with the rocky desert floor. There were no neighbors visible, no other buildings, just sand, stones, and cacti as far as the eye could see. The bungalow itself looked exactly like the photos. Small, single-story, with tan-colored walls and a flat roof. A narrow wooden porch ran along the front, and large sliding glass doors led to the main room. Inside, it was sparse but comfortable. A small kitchenette with basic appliances, a simple bed with a thick mattress, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a single ceiling fan that barely moved the still desert air. The place smelled faintly of dust and the desert sun, and I could see traces of sand blown in from the open windows. I unpacked my camera and tripod, and decided to take advantage of the early night for some star photography. I stepped outside, the desert cool but not cold, the ground firm beneath my boots. The sky was breathtaking, a vast canvas of black with millions of stars scattered across it, brighter and clearer than anything I had seen in the city. I set up my tripod a few feet from the porch and started taking long exposure shots, moving around carefully so as not to disturb the camera. After a while, I noticed a figure at the edge of the property line, standing completely still. At first, I thought it might be another stargazer or a neighbor, but there had been no mention of anyone else staying close by. I squinted into the dark, trying to make out details. The figure didn't move, didn't wave or signal, just stood there, almost like it was watching me. I convinced myself it was probably a hiker or someone camping nearby, though it was strange that no lights or a flashlight were visible. I shook my head and focused back on my camera, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. When I finally went inside, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Every window in the bungalow had a faint footprint mark on the glass. Not dusty smudges from the wind or sand, but clear impressions as if someone had pressed a foot against the glass and stepped away. I checked the screens, the edges of the windows, everything. There was no way the wind or desert animals could have caused it. It looked like someone had been standing just outside the bungalow, pressing against every window, watching. My heart was racing, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an optical illusion caused by the dust on the glass, maybe an old cleaning residue. But deep down I knew it wasn't. I locked all the doors, double-checked the deadbolt, and went to bed, pulling the covers tight around me. The desert night was silent except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional desert wind that rattled the blinds. Around midnight, I woke up to the feeling of being watched. I had tried to fall asleep, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things, but the feeling was undeniable. I peeked through the blinds, and there it was again. The shadow moved between the cacti outside, closer than before. It didn't run, didn't wave, didn't make a sound. It was deliberate, slow, and controlled. My stomach dropped. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, tall or short. The darkness of the desert made it impossible to see any features, but the posture was unmistakably human. I grabbed my car keys from the table and slipped outside quietly. The sand crunched beneath my boots, and the porch creaked slightly under my weight. I started the car and shined the headlights across the property, sweeping over the cacti, the rocks, the sand. The figure was gone. There was no one, nothing, just the empty desert and the cold, quiet air. I drove slowly in circles, shining the lights around, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. The property seemed empty, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I had just been watched by someone who knew I was there. I spent the rest of the night in the car, doors locked, engine running intermittently to keep the air moving, trying to calm down and catch some sleep. By morning, I could see the desert clearly in the daylight, and nothing seemed out of place. The bungalow was intact, no signs of forced entry, no footprints around the porch, just the faint marks on the windows that had been there the night before. I packed up my camera, tripod, and bags, feeling anxious to leave, but knowing I had to wait until I could talk to the host and figure out what was going on. When the host arrived later in the morning, they confirmed something that made my stomach drop even more. They said no one else rented nearby, not in months. The nearest property was more than a mile away, and the desert land around the bungalow was private and mostly inaccessible. There was no logical explanation for the footprints, the shadow I had seen, or the figure outside. The host suggested it might have been a hiker or someone wandering through the area, but given the distance from any trail and the isolation, it seemed nearly impossible. I felt a mix of relief and continued fear, knowing the person could have been watching the bungalow for hours, or that it had been someone who lived in the desert or drove out there for reasons I couldn't comprehend. The thought that someone had been so close to me, invisible in the dark desert, made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I left the bungalow that afternoon, driving slowly back to the main highway, constantly checking the rearview mirror. The desert rolled past, endless and silent, and I felt a lingering unease that didn't fade until I reached the city. Back in my apartment, the image of the figure and the footprints stayed with me for weeks. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it completely. I later learned that Joshua Tree had occasional reports of trespassers or vandals on isolated properties, people who walked long distances through the desert just to be unseen. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a ghost, but it was real, and that reality was far more frightening to me. The desert had allowed someone to approach the bungalow without my knowledge, and the sheer isolation of the place meant there was nowhere to run and no one to call. Even now, months later, whenever I see photos of the desert at night, I think of that weekend. The stillness, the complete silence, the emptiness that hides danger. The bungalow had been beautiful and serene in the daylight, but at night, it had revealed how vulnerable one could be when completely alone in a place where no one was watching over you. I never returned to that rental, and I never stayed alone in a similar isolated desert location again. The experience left a mark, an understanding that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but the real people who can quietly exist in your blind spots, unseen, waiting, and capable of observing without your knowledge. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend away in the Blue Ridge Mountains for months. Work had been non-stop, emails piling up, and sleep had become something I only caught in fragments. I wanted nothing more than to be alone for a few days, to breathe fresh mountain air, and to sit on a porch watching the mist roll over the peaks. I found a cabin near Asheville through Airbnb. The listing was simple but enticing: rustic charm, secluded privacy, a place where I could disconnect completely. The photos were perfect, exposed wood beams, a small stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch that seemed to hug the mountainside. I booked it immediately. I arrived late Friday evening. The sun had long since set, and the drive up the winding mountain roads had been slower than I expected. The headlights illuminated stretches of forest, thick with pines and oaks, the occasional deer darting into the shadows. By the time I turned onto the small gravel driveway, the cabin was bathed in the soft glow of the porch light. It looked exactly like the photos, maybe even better in person. I parked my car, stretched, and carried my bag up the small wooden steps to the porch. The smell of pine and wet earth filled the air, and the quiet was immediate, almost unnerving after the constant hum of the city. Inside, the cabin was warm, cozy. The wood floors creaked under my weight, the stone fireplace looked inviting, and the furniture, though simple, was comfortable. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to adjust to the silence. That's when I noticed the door. It was at the top of a short staircase in the corner of the living room, made of thick, old wood with a heavy padlock securing it. The kind of lock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. My curiosity got the better of me, so I took a few steps toward it, examining the door. It looked like it led to a small attic or storage space. I assumed it was just old tools, maybe some boxes that the host didn't want people messing with. Later, I asked the host about it. She was a woman in her late 40s, friendly enough, but there was something in her expression I couldn't read. She gave me a vague smile and said, "Oh, just some old stuff up there. Nothing you need to worry about." That was it. No stories, no warnings, nothing. I decided not to press further. I had a weekend to relax, and I didn't want to start it feeling uncomfortable. The first night passed slowly. The cabin was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small noise. Every hour or so, I thought I heard the creaking of floorboards above me, like someone pacing back and forth. I told myself it was just the house settling, the old beams reacting to the night air. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept drifting back to the locked door, wondering why it seemed like the noises were coming from that exact spot. Around 3 in the morning, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. My heart raced. I froze, straining my ears. Then came another sound, unmistakable, the rattling of the padlock. It wasn't slow or hesitant. It was sharp, deliberate, as if someone was trying to open it from the inside. My stomach sank, and my hands shook. I grabbed my phone and called the host, hoping she would answer. Nothing. I left a message and sat in the living room, the lights on, listening. Every little creak, every tiny groan of the wood made my anxiety spike. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, but clear enough that I couldn't ignore it. "Why are you here?" It came from above, from the direction of the locked door. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just listened, frozen. The whisper was gone as quickly as it came, leaving the silence heavier than before. I stayed there until sunrise, the lights still on, trying to convince myself that it had been a dream. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed sharper in the morning light, and I could feel the weight of the locked door every time I passed it. I didn't try to sleep again that night, instead pacing the cabin, checking windows and doors, trying to reassure myself that I was alone. The rest of the night passed in small bursts of movement and long stretches of staring at the ceiling. By morning, I had made a decision. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, trying not to think about what might be behind that door, trying not to imagine someone, or something, had been watching me. I left without telling the host about what had happened, without asking for a refund or an explanation. I drove down the mountain, keeping my eyes on the road and the trees at the edges of my headlights, ignoring the lingering feeling that I hadn't fully left. A few days later, I ran into a local at a small coffee shop in Asheville. I mentioned the cabin in passing, describing the location, and he hesitated, looking at me oddly. He leaned in slightly and said quietly that the previous tenant had reported strange noises coming from the attic for months. He mentioned that the noises were never explained, and that the host never mentioned them to anyone else. The tone of his voice made it clear that he didn't recommend staying there. My stomach turned as I realized I hadn't imagined it. The noises, the whisper, the rattling of the padlock. it had all been real. After that, I never thought about returning to the cabin. I looked up the listing again, and it was still there, described in glowing terms, with photos that didn't hint at the locked door or the noises above. It was just another rental to most people, but for me, it became a warning. I told myself I would be more careful, more cautious in the future. I realized that the world has quiet corners where things don't make sense, where ordinary, everyday places can feel wrong in ways you can't explain. The cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains was one of those places. It had the perfect appearance, the charm, the seclusion, but underneath, there was something hidden, something I wasn't meant to see. I came away from that weekend with a heightened sense of awareness. I started checking locks twice, listening to every sound at night, and never underestimating the weight of an unexplained noise. The cabin taught me that sometimes danger isn't obvious, that the ordinary can hide the unsettling, and that curiosity can put you in situations you never expected. I never returned, and I never will. Even now, months later, I can still hear the faint creak of the floorboards above that locked door, and I feel a chill remembering the whisper. It was real, and it was enough to make me respect the silence and the unknown. Some places, I realized, are better left alone. I had booked a small studio apartment in Shibuya for a business trip. The location was perfect, right in the heart of the city, and the price was reasonable for such a central spot. The apartment itself was tiny, more like a single room than a full studio, but it had everything I needed: a small kitchenette, a compact bathroom, a bed pushed against one wall, and a desk near the window. The host had been very responsive and professional over email, confirming every detail and giving clear instructions for check-in. Everything seemed normal, and I felt confident that my stay would be simple and uneventful. I arrived late in the evening after a long flight. The airport was hectic, and the train ride into Shibuya had been crowded and exhausting. By the time I reached the apartment, it was almost midnight. I followed the host's instructions carefully, got inside the building, and found the studio without any trouble. At first glance, it was neat and clean. The floors were polished, and the small living area looked tidy, almost like a hotel room. There was a faint smell of cleaning supplies, which at first felt reassuring. I put my bag down, checked that the door was locked properly, and collapsed onto the bed. My body felt heavy with fatigue, and sleep came almost immediately. A few hours later, I woke up suddenly, not from a noise but from a feeling. It was a sensation that someone was in the room, watching me. The room was pitch black, and at first, I tried to convince myself it was just a dream or the jet lag playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling persisted, a heavy pressure on the back of my neck, as if eyes were fixed on me. My heart started beating faster, a slow panic rising in my chest. I reached out to the bedside table and fumbled for my phone. The light from the screen illuminated the room, just enough to make me notice something unusual. In the corner near the ceiling, partially hidden behind a small shelf, there was a tiny blinking red light. My stomach dropped. I froze and stared at it, heart pounding, my mind racing. Slowly, I realized what it must be: a camera. A real, functional camera watching me while I slept. I felt a cold wave of nausea, and my thoughts spiraled. How long had it been there? Who was watching me? Why? I got out of bed, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, trying not to make any noise. I scanned the room, looking in every possible corner. I unplugged the Wi-Fi router, thinking it might cut off any remote feed, but the red light remained, steady and small. I checked the smoke detector next, running my hands carefully along its edges. My fingers brushed a tiny lens embedded in the surface. It was hidden well, but I had found it. I felt a mixture of anger, fear, and violation. My privacy had been completely invaded, and I couldn't believe it had happened in a legitimate short-term rental. I sat on the edge of the bed, trembling slightly, trying to process what to do next. My first instinct was to contact the host, and I did, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. His response was quick, almost too quick. He sounded apologetic and claimed he used the camera for security purposes. He said he would delete all footage and promised it was never meant to be personal. But the words felt hollow, and I didn't trust him. My mind kept running through the possibilities of how long I might have been recorded, the number of people who could have access to the footage, and what they might have seen. The sense of exposure was suffocating. I packed my bag quietly, trying to avoid touching anything unnecessarily in the apartment. Every movement reminded me of the camera in the corner, and I imagined it recording my every action. I left behind most of my belongings, not wanting to risk them being stolen or used in some way. I double-checked the door lock, stepped into the hallway, and walked briskly to the street. The neon lights of Shibuya were bright, almost too bright, and the city felt chaotic and alive, but it offered a strange sense of relief compared to the oppressive fear inside the apartment. I found a hotel nearby and booked a room for the night without hesitation. The hotel was larger, impersonal, and completely different from the apartment. The reception area smelled of disinfectant, the hallways were carpeted, and my room had multiple locks on the door. I felt a tentative sense of safety, though my body remained tense. I stayed awake most of the night, checking the locks repeatedly, inspecting the room for any signs of surveillance. Every small noise, the hum of the air conditioner, the distant sounds of traffic, made me jump. I couldn't stop replaying the moment I had seen the red light. The image of the lens in the smoke detector burned into my mind. The next day, I contacted the local authorities. I explained the situation, providing the host's contact information and the address of the apartment. They confirmed what I had feared. Hidden cameras in short-term rentals are illegal in Japan. They told me that while the law is strict, some hosts still install them to monitor guests, and it can be difficult to catch them before they are taken down. They suggested I file a report, and that an inspection of the apartment could lead to legal action, but the thought of returning there filled me with dread. I never went back. In the days that followed, I tried to settle back into my routine, but the sense of violation lingered. I changed my passwords, kept my devices under close watch, and felt a strange hesitation every time I used a camera or microphone. The incident left me cautious, hyper-aware of any potential breach of privacy, and unwilling to trust short-term rentals without careful inspection. I realized how easily personal space could be invaded, how small and ordinary objects could hide threats, and how vulnerable I had been in that tiny apartment. Eventually, I returned home, but the experience stayed with me. I stopped using certain rental apps, researched hosts more thoroughly, and made it a rule to inspect any place I stayed carefully. I became more aware of my surroundings, more cautious about who I allowed access to my space. I never received any proof that the footage was saved or shared, and I tried not to think about it too much, but a lingering unease remained. The memory of that small red light, blinking steadily from its hidden corner, never truly left me. What I took away from the experience was a clear understanding of boundaries and the importance of vigilance. I learned that even places that seem professional and trustworthy can harbor hidden dangers. I made a personal rule to prioritize my safety and privacy above convenience or cost. In the end, I moved on with my trip, finished my work, and left Tokyo without further incident, but the fear and discomfort from that night remained an indelible part of the memory. I felt wiser and more careful because of it, and I carried that caution with me to every future trip, never again allowing myself to feel completely safe in someone else's space without thorough verification. I booked an Airbnb in Neukölln, Berlin, mostly because of its central location and the price, which seemed reasonable for the area. The photos showed a modern, tidy apartment on the third floor of an older building, with high ceilings, wooden floors, and large windows. The host had been friendly over email, clear about check-in, and welcoming in person. When I arrived, I found the apartment exactly as advertised, clean, modern, and quiet, despite being so close to busy streets and cafes. The living area was open and bright, with a small kitchen tucked into the corner, and the bedroom was separated by a sliding door. I noticed thick curtains covering the windows, which made the room feel insulated and private. In the corner of the bedroom, there was a small adjoining room with a solid wooden door and an old, rusty lock. When I asked about it, the host said it was just extra storage, and that it wasn't something I needed to worry about. That seemed reasonable at the time, so I didn't think much of it. The first night, I went to bed around midnight. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. I was drifting off when I heard a faint tapping behind the locked door. At first, I thought it was the pipes or maybe someone in the street, but the sound was soft and precise, like fingertips hitting the wood in a slow, rhythmic pattern. I listened for a few minutes, but it stopped. I dismissed it as nothing and eventually fell asleep, though my mind kept returning to the noise. The second night, I went to bed earlier, trying to ignore the previous night's tapping. Around 1:17 a.m., the sound returned. This time, it was more persistent, almost deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention through the door. I froze in bed, listening, my heart starting to beat faster. The tapping continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. I lay there awake for hours, unable to sleep, staring at the closed door, imagining all sorts of possibilities. I didn't hear anyone else in the apartment, and the street outside was silent. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off, but I felt tense and uneasy. By the third night, the noise had changed. I was lying in bed when I heard it again at exactly 1:17 a.m. But this time, it wasn't just tapping. It was scratching, rough and uneven, like fingernails scraping against wood. I sat up slowly, straining my ears, trying to tell myself it was just the building settling, maybe a loose piece of trim or some rodent behind the wall. But the sound was too focused, too close, too deliberate. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to go near the door, but I couldn't stop listening. The scratching lasted longer this time, and I thought I heard faint, uneven breathing coming from the small room. I wasn't imagining it. There was someone or something inside, breathing quietly, deliberately. I lay there stiff, barely daring to move, until the sounds faded, and the apartment returned to silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I called the host, trying to ask more about the room. She laughed softly, as if I were joking, and said it was just an old building, and I shouldn't worry. She said no one had lived there for years, and that it was likely just the building making noises. I didn't argue, but I felt a knot in my stomach that didn't go away. I spent the day exploring the neighborhood, trying to distract myself, but every time I thought about going back to the apartment, my chest tightened. I started imagining what could be behind that door. Maybe a previous tenant had left something, maybe it was a maintenance issue, or maybe someone was secretly using it. None of the possibilities were comforting. That night, I couldn't sleep in the bedroom. I moved my mattress to the living room, placing it near the window and away from the locked door. I tried to distract myself with music on my phone, but as the clock approached 1:17 a.m., the familiar scratching began again. I held my breath, hoping it would stop, but then I heard it clearly, breathing low and slow, coming from the room. It wasn't random. It was steady, almost like someone was awake inside, listening. I felt trapped, paralyzed by fear. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, trying to rationalize it, but nothing fit. I didn't hear any movement from outside the apartment, no footsteps in the hallway, no voices from the street. Just the breathing, calm and deliberate, coming from that locked room. I realized I couldn't stay. I felt a surge of urgency, a need to leave before whatever was inside decided to move. I didn't pack carefully or quietly. I threw my things into my bag, grabbed my phone, wallet, and keys, and left the apartment in the dark. I didn't look back at the door, didn't check the windows, just ran down the stairs and out into the empty street. The cold night air hit me, and I felt some of the tension in my body start to release, but I didn't stop moving until I was several blocks away. The next day, I met a friend who had been to Berlin before. I told them about the apartment, and they mentioned that the building had previously housed artist studios, and one room had been converted into a small, soundproof space for practicing music. No one had lived in it for years, and it was generally empty. That explained the soundproofing, but it didn't explain the tapping, scratching, or breathing I had heard at night. It was unsettling to think about how the building had been used before, and what could be inside that room. Even if it was abandoned, the sounds had felt intentional, and the air of quiet control in the room had made me uneasy in a way that nothing else had. I ended up booking a hotel for the rest of my stay. I didn't want to spend another night in that apartment, no matter how convenient the location or reasonable the price. Staying in the hotel, I could finally sleep, though I stayed alert, checking the door and locking it, making sure no one could get in. I walked through Neukölln during the day, enjoying the city, but I avoided that street entirely, imagining that small locked room and the deliberate noises it had made. I never found out exactly what, or who, was in that room, but I realized that some things didn't need explaining to make them dangerous or unsettling. The experience left me tense, aware, and cautious in a way I hadn't been before. I finished my trip early and flew home, avoiding the neighborhood, and never returned to that apartment. The memory of the noises, the tapping, scratching, and low breathing behind the locked door stayed with me for months afterward. Even now, thinking about it, I can feel the tension and unease that night had created, and I know I made the right choice leaving before I found out the truth. Some doors are better left closed, and some apartments are better avoided.